Hello, everyone. We'll be starting in just a minute or two. Okay, Navras, the floor is yours.
Warm greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am Navras Afridi, co-convener of the webinar series on anti-Semitism in East and Southeast Asia in comparative perspective. And I'm delighted to welcome today my co-convener of the series, Dr. Mary J. Ainslie, who will be speaking to us on anti-Semitism and Philosemitism in Malaysia. Dr. Mary J. Ainslie is Associate Professor in Media and Communications and Deputy Head of School at the School of International Communications, University of Nottingham, Ningbo campus. Her research specializes in intercultural links across the Asia region, and she has won funding from the Korea Foundation, the Academy of Korean Studies, and the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She is the author of Anti-Semitism in Contemporary Malaysia, Malay Nationalism, Philosemitism, and Pro-Israeli Expressions, a book that was the result of the first project to empirically examine anti-Semitism in Malaysia. In 2021, Dr. Ainslie initiated the first academic collaboration between Israel and a Malaysian educational institution in order to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day for the first time in Malaysia. So it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Ainslie for today's webinar. Dr. Ainslie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Navras. Can you hear me okay? Oh, great.
Perfect.
Wonderful. Okay, then I'll start sharing my screen and I'll start sharing my PowerPoint for the presentation. Okay. Okay, and Navras, you can see this all right?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Okay, then I will begin. So first of all, thank you very much. It's really interesting to be presenting on the series that I was organizing myself to get together with Navras. So I hope that I can do as good a job as all of the wonderful speakers before me did. So this episode in the series is focusing, of course, on Malaysia. I lived in Malaysia. I was in Southeast Asia for around 10 years, and I was in Malaysia for around 6 years. And this, of course, as Navras was saying, is a presentation that is based on the book that I published in 2019, which is Antisemitism in Contemporary Malaysia. And that is the first book-length project on this topic. Now, when I first came to Malaysia and to Southeast Asia, I was very interested, of course, to learn that Malaysia is known as one of the most anti-Semitic nations in the world. It has one of the highest, and certainly one of the highest in Asia, rates of anti-Semitic beliefs and discourses, and we can sort of we can query that that measurement, but certainly it is very much an established discourse within the country. As you'll see here, there are no established diplomatic ties. There's no official trade with Israel. There is unofficial, of course, but certainly not an official level. Malaysian citizens are banned from visiting Israel, with a few exceptions of Christian pilgrimages, but very few. Israeli citizens cannot visit Malaysia, though some do on different passports. And we see a lot of these anti-Semitic beliefs. We see these descriptions from academics of a kind of hotbed of anti-Semitism, Asia's anti-Semitic capital. The idea that 61% of the adult population harbor anti-Semitic attitudes, which is much higher than somewhere like, for instance, Iran, which might be more traditionally associated with this. And it's also much higher than its neighbor, Indonesia. And we also as well see, particularly around kind of 2014, which was part of the time that I was based in the nation, as quite a lot of kind of intimidation and even outright violence towards anything that represented Israel and Judaism. And you'll see here that we have some images from within the country. So here, as I said, we see the Malaysian passport, valid for all countries except Israel. We see protests with banners saying things like Israel is not a real country here. The idea of the Israeli flag here. There was the banning of athletes from the Olympics, Israeli athletes from Olympics. We have signs like this asking to protect from Jews, for instance. So all of this quite strong and quite shocking at times anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli discourse. And this, of course, is very odd because Malaysia is very far from Israel. There is no significant historical or contemporary Jewish presence here. And there are other significant humanitarian issues within the country. So why do we kind of have this sort of obsession with Jewish people and with Israel to such a significant extent? What exactly is going on? Well, there is actually research that is written about anti-Semitism in Malaysia and about its function. So I will talk a little bit about that and then what my project itself sought to add to this. So first of all, we do have a history of Jews and anti-Semitism in Southeast Asia, and one of our previous speakers did actually talk about this. We have a small sort of historical Jewish populations throughout the major Southeast Asian nations. We don't have any kind of what we call classical anti-Semitism, perhaps, or real anti-Semitism, as we might understand it as a term, as a dominant term. This is pretty much kind of European, shall we say, in origin, and of course, partly across the Arab world too. We do have some changes occurring in the 20th century. Oh, this is a picture of the grave of the last Malaysian Jew, actually, who was a gentleman who was from the Malaysian Jewish community, which was a very small community that existed on the island of Penang there. But anyway, we do have some changes here in the 20th century. So we do have an increase in the region of anti-Semitic literature after the 1930s. A lot of it was translated from Europe. We have the development of race-based politics, which, while they may have been discredited officially in Europe, did continue in Southeast and also East Asia. So we have a strongly kind of racialized political system that I will talk about. Also as well, we have the Palestinian struggles of the 1980s that kind of, when these became sort of part of kind of religious nationalism and Islamic religious nationalism at this time, and a form of kind of Islamic religious identity, this began to fuel sort of such discourses in Southeast Asian Islamic countries. Now, ultimately, as I said previously, there isn't a concrete Jewish presence in Malaysia, and nor has there really been in the country's history. We have the small Penang Jewish community, but throughout Southeast Asia, really, these small communities didn't really enter into the sort of histories of the region so much because they were quite small, and they dwindled, shall we say, in the 20th century. And I'd encourage people who want to know more about that to listen to some of our earlier speakers on the topic who know far more than I do about this topic. But ultimately, within Malaysia, we have this phenomenon that is known basically as anti-Semitism without Jews. So this is notion when theorists say that we see this imaginary Jewish person. So personifying kind of sources of power which hinder or prevent social and geographical mobility. So it's a kind of other figure that is taking on blame for different social ills. And ultimately, this is a kind of a theoretical concept. It's not a concrete reality. But it's important that this isn't dismissed. So just because there are no Jewish people to persecute directly, shall we say, within Malaysia does not mean this is not quite an important does not mean this is not an important phenomenon that must be addressed. And significantly, what scholars understand is that this actually acts as a template and a prop for other forms of internal racial discrimination. So the question then is, if we're talking about these social ills they're taking on blame for, well, what are those kind of social ills? Well, in Southeast Asia and in Malaysia in particular, what a lot of scholars say is that anti-Semitism operates as a proxy for racism against the very large local Chinese populations. We have these diasporic Chinese communities within Southeast Asia that have been present now for quite a few hundred years. There are, and obviously people who have also come more recently during the European colonial era. There are a lot of concrete comparisons and links with Jewish communities, all right, with the way that these function as diasporic communities in the region and the way that Jewish diasporic communities would also have functioned, say, in Europe in particular. We see there being frequent persecution towards these minorities, which are also quite large minorities in some cases. So they become outsiders to whom we see stereotypes and myths about beliefs and religious practices, which become sort of attached to them. And there's a very strong recognized relationship between beliefs in Jewish conspiracy theories and anti-Chinese racism in countries like Thailand and like Malaysia and like Indonesia. And this is all sort of literature that has been written about before. So there's an intensification of these discourses in the 20th century, the rise of modern nationalism. We see these difficult social changes, this sort of xenophobia and hardened attitudes towards outsiders. So we're seeing kind of this economic boom, we're seeing nationalism grow, we're seeing racial politics within this, and we're seeing kind of rapid urbanization, which kind of destabilizes the situation. And there are parallels between this and sort of 19th century Europe in this case. Also after the 1990s and the kind of economic boom and bust, we also see a targeting of the Chinese minorities as kind of scapegoats here, okay? We see Chinese commerce seeming to be the kind of unspoken target of anti-Jewish rhetoric here. So basically we're kind of sort of taking these beliefs and sort of putting them we're kind of constructing anti-Semitic beliefs, but what they're really aimed at is often local Chinese communities, and this can kind of work sort of vice versa. This also becomes quite significant if we look at contemporary Malaysia itself, all right, the specific nation here. If we want to move kind of from beyond the kind of wider region and kind of looking at Thailand and Indonesia and these kind of links between them, if we want to look at Malaysia, there's also some very specific things going on within the nation. First of all, it's a very multiracial and it's a very ethnically diverse nation. Specifically, 60% of the population are of Malay ethnicity. Now, and these would be sort of constructed as the sort of natives of the country. Now, 60% is quite a small majority though. And here, of course, we have the Chinese minority, and 25% is quite a large minority within a nation, say, much larger than Indonesia next door. Also, we have around 7% of Indian origin too. We have a political system that is built around these minorities. Now, the issue is as well, of course, because of this, if you can control the, if you can have political parties adapted for each and you can appeal to them through racial and religious issues, then you can begin to control the vote. So it is the size of these minorities, these racial groups, shall we say, that start to become significant to racializing the political system. So we have this racialized political system and a strong intertwining of religion and race. Now, what I mean by this is that if you are Malay in Malaysia, most of the time you are considered to be Muslim, and that's legal. That's a legal status within law, with some exceptions. And you often cannot change your religion as well. Also, as well, there are significant economic and geographical disparities between the groups. So the Malay minority, the Malay majority, sorry, are much poorer generally than the Chinese minority, who are often constructed as much wealthier because they tend to be very urban based in essence. So there are strong economic and geographical disparities between them, which lead to resentment, shall we say. Also as well, because of this kind of economic disparity, there tends to be some privileges that are attached to Malays. So there will be Malay nationalism. There will be Malays it's easier to buy houses in certain areas if you're of Malay ethnicity in a certain way, and you get certain better rates, for instance, and some economic opportunities there. And as I said previously, there's a strong relationship between ethnicity and religion. So if you're ethnically Malay, you're considered to be Muslim, and you also have religious law having precedence over civil law in the personal lives of Muslim people. So what this means is if you're of a certain race, you're governed by different laws in essence. And a lot of this sounds sort of quite surprising, shall we say, to some people. And we're going to talk about how it's difficult to maintain a system such as that in a nation that is urbanizing and modernizing very, very rapidly, and also one that is becoming increasingly globally aware. Now, if we move to the 1970s, we see ultimately here that we have an increasingly state-led version of Islam, one that ultimately is about intensifying the role of Islam in people's personal and political lives. A lot of this was about constructing a form of Malay unity and increasing opportunities for Malay people and unifying Malay people. And this was because also that Malay people were very poor at the time. They didn't have a lot of opportunities, and Islam was seen as a way of being able to kind of unify the group and get more kind of opportunities in general for this group. So there was a strong association within the 1970s to construct Malay identity closely with Islam. And also as well, this was about defining Malaysia as an Islamic nation. So strengthening ties with Arab nations. Malaysia, of course, is not an Arab nation. It was always on the periphery of the Muslim world. And there was always these sort of questions about, are you a genuine Islamic nation? Are the Malays real Muslims, for example, because Malay Islam is a different form of different form of Islam. So there's often this kind of idea that we need to be more central. We need to prove kind of our religiousness to the rest of the Islamic world. Within this, what we see here is a desire to assert Malayness as an identity. So this kind of state-promoted concept, the idea that the Malay race is kind of has supremacy within the nation. And one effect of this as well was turning non-Malay ethnic groups into second-class citizens. So this becomes a source of continuing frustration for these kind of large Indian and Chinese minorities in particular. And as well, there's some increased resentment and persecutions of non-Muslims, particularly of Christians, and who also, Malaysian Christians, tend to be Chinese. There's a lot of this idea as well of constructing Malay people as having been dispossessed, as being kind of native victims who are at kind of the mercy of these foreign kind of Chinese oppressors who come into the country and have kind of taken all the wealth, and this idea that Islam is this means of kind of liberating them. And you do see, as I said, these economic disparities between the racial groups that are uncomfortable and that certainly make this perspective seem very valid here. And ultimately, we see here that there are kind of very concrete parallels at times between the treatment of Jews and the treatment of the Chinese in this kind of suspicion towards people who are kind of hoarding wealth within the country. Now, one name that we always hear within this, of course, is Mahathir. Mahathir was the most electorally successful prime minister in Malaysian history. He very much adopted the Palestinian cause from sort of quite early on in his tenure, okay? And this was a way for him to kind of prove the religious credentials of his regime and also push kind of Malay Islam as a way to unify the Malay group here. And we see political organizations such as the party that was UMNO, the United Malays National Organization, placing this emphasis on religious nationalism as this form of identity and kind of unifying Malays and getting votes through this. And ultimately drawing a parallel between this kind of outside colonialist threat that supposedly would face Palestinian people and that facing Malays in their own land, which of course is namely the kind of Chinese minorities. And ultimately as well, the language often used here to depict this cause implies that you must have Malay unity, that ultimately the political parties and the Malay political parties will be kind of the protectors of this. We also see at the end of Mahathir's kind of tenure, his first tenure, we see somewhat of an opening space for liberal expression. And then we see a backlash against this. So here we're going to around kind of 2010 here, I would say. We see an increase in Malay supremacy, so kind of Malay nationalism, the connection between Malays and Malaysia and the land in particular. And we also see an advance in what we call performative religion. So this kind of means sort of, if something's performative, then you're kind of adopting signs of it. It's not a theological engagement. It's basically trying to kind of out-religious other people and kind of show and demonstrate physically that you're more religious than other people. And ultimately, one part of this was, of course, investing in the Palestinian cause very much. And ultimately as well, we see a couple of like religious and Malay and Islamic parties, political parties within Malaysia trying to compete with one another for this vote and actually trying to kind of out-Islamicize each other at times as well. So the PAS, which was the kind of religious Islamic party within Malaysia, was trying to compete with sort of the Malay Islamic party in Malaysia. And they're trying to sort of basically show that they have ownership over discourse, over religious discourse. And this is all about performative. It's not about kind of actually theologically engaging with texts here. And a lot of this again goes back to also reclaiming Malaysia from this kind of periphery of the world here. And of course, here we see now that ultimately we see a strong identity with the Palestinian cause. And this is now, of course, by this time, a form of identity in the Muslim world. And ultimately, as well, it realizes itself in strong anti-Israel rhetoric here. So we see kind of the Palestinian cause in a very, very sort of simplified version here, becoming very powerful as a political purpose within Malaysia, and people becoming incredibly passionate about this. And ultimately, this kind of morphs into highly anti-Semitic discourse, very, very anti-Semitic discourse, extremely religious, and also one that is significantly high against Israel. And you see a number of quotes that I have here, and this is actually photos that I have kind of from around Kuala Lumpur. These are from some of the Malay social media pages as well. And you'll see here within the bookstores in Kuala Lumpur, so these are mainstream bookstores, you'll have, for instance, Malay translation of Henry Ford here. You have Mein Kampf here as well. So, and this kind of more local Southeast Asian literature too. So you see all of this literature available here. Now, my interest was not actually in this as a researcher. This has been, we know about this. We know it exists and we know why it exists. I was less interested in further exploring this as a discourse. And I was much more interested in saying, well, if anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli discourse becomes this kind of means of ideological expression and allying oneself with this kind of quite reactionary and fundamentalist kind of discourse and nationalistic and racial religious discourse, then ultimately what happens to the people who are actually not interested in that? Do we have pro-Israeli views and criticism performing a social function as well in Malaysia? Because that was what I had experienced. I'd come to a nation that was extremely anti-Semitic, or supposed to be highly anti-Semitic, and actually that wasn't my personal experience. I saw a lot of interest in Israel and interest in Judaism, and I saw people actually not liking this label at all. And I realized this was something that wasn't being explored, shall I say. So that was really what I was more interested in. And also it fitted with the contemporary context, all right, which was one of kind of this idea of people starting to question the political situation in Malaysia starting to become very polarized, and the different factions starting to actually question this. So what ultimately did it mean to be Malay? What did it mean to be Malaysian? What does it mean to be Islamic? What does it mean to be Christian? And now, of course, you have these traditional rural urban economic divisions really changing. And the biggest division, the biggest change here is really the growth of urban Malays. So previously you'd had this split, Malays were poorer and rural, but now you have this growing kind of both rural and urban middle class of Malays who are now globally connected, are thinking more theologically about their religion and their own identity, and of course are more interested in Israel and Judaism. So you have all of these economic changes going on that challenge this kind of discourse, I'd say. So that was really what I was more interested in exploring. As well, if you actually go back to the same bookshop, then you'll also see, alongside all of those anti-Semitic works of literature I just pulled up, you also see works like this as well. So you see things like sort of Holocaust memoirs, history of the story of the Jews, Israel a history, and these are in the same bookshop that are actually selling those other books as well. So you're thinking, hang on a second, what exactly is going on here? All right, how do these two discourses exist at the same time within this nation? There's also some online evidence of opposition as well. So I saw that there was online statements where people are kind of saying, hang on, this is not right. You know, Dr. Mahathir is blaming the entire world's problem on Israel. He's linking everything to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, quit blaming the Jews, take more responsibility for who we are. So all of this kind of sort of evidence perhaps of some form of questioning here. And I realized this wasn't being studied. So I started to gather participants, and it was highly sensitive. It had to be kept very anonymous and very secretive as a project. So I managed to identify people through snowballing and people who are interested in talking about this. It had to be a qualitative project. Some of the interviews I did with people took hours and hours. And ultimately, people were very mixed in their background as well. And I also complemented it with a number of other interviews with kind of left-wing politicians and some people who work for NGOs and the Malaysian Bar Council as well. So some religious figures too. So I tried to sort of have a number of people I interviewed as part of the project. I was really interested in kind of this group of people who had sort of what could be positive or perhaps neutral views within Malaysia. Neutral views towards Israel in Malaysia are still pretty groundbreaking, shall we say, given the wider context here. And I got a lot of, I had a great deal of data, a lot of interview data. And so I divided it into 4 areas. So the first was actually finding out about anti-Semitism in Malaysia, so people reporting their own experiences. The next one was looking at the function of this. And this basically confirmed a lot of what was written already. And then there was the idea of there being a connection between the rejection of anti-Semitism, a dissatisfaction with Malaysian politics and the Malaysian state, and then this notion of there being some forms of kind of pro-Israel expressions within there, curiosity about Israel, some support, and also elements of philosemitism in there too. So first of all, when I looked at characterizing anti-Semitism in Malaysia, overwhelmingly, this confirmed what was there, that this was a kind of morally correct position. It was part of being Malaysian, it was part of being Malay, and ultimately, I even found it could be considerably worse than what has actually been reported so far. Many participants were angry, frustrated, and embarrassed. They didn't like talking about this that existed within their country, but they did. They let me know all about it. They said the way that Israel is constructed is demonic in many ways. It was the idea of shutting out Judaism in Israel from the country. There was intimidation, they felt, particularly from Islamic participants, and a lot of conspiracies about Israel and Jewish influence as well. And a lot of them talked about how they'd actually asked their friends, why do you hate Israel? And they couldn't actually give them a clear answer, for instance. And one talked about how when she went to a religious school, she was simply taught that Jewish people are bad. And also and one actually said, one young Chinese man actually had some Palestinian friends, some Arab friends who went to his college, and they were actually quite amazed at the levels of anti-Semitism in Malaysia even. The second section then I looked at was the kind of function of anti-Semitism, the function of the situation here. So the idea was ultimately that they said this is nothing about human rights. It hasn't, and it's got anything to do with the violation of human rights, because there are so many issues within Malaysia that need attention here. They basically just kind of said that this is something that is about Arabization and Muslim solidarity, so creating ties with other Islamic nations, distracting from human rights issues within the country, and a very, very easy means to retain power, and for the ruling party to retain power, and also creating significant social division as well. And we see here this social division. They noted here, they said things like the government divides and rules using the Palestinian conflict in order to segregate people. And one said, when I was 14 years old, we had a World War II movie marathon. My friends were invited, and by the end of the movie, which was the boy in the striped pajamas, all of us non-Muslims were really sad for the boy who was taken away. And I found that some of my Malay friends were like, I'm so glad they got rid of him. And I was like, what? That was the most awkward movie marathon I've ever had. And she says at 14, I was just like, what's going on? So suddenly there's this instant division, okay, within this kind of group of friends that is caused by this. And the participants really believe that this is what this is being used for. And also as well, this strong notion of Arabization. And by Arabization, what they mean is this idea of ultimately trying to prove that you're more Islamic by being closer to Arab countries. And this idea that Malay Islam is not genuine, is not kind of Muslim enough. And for a lot of the Malays, they saw this as being quite sad in a way. They said it's okay to try new things, but the idea that our traditions and our religious tradition are being kind of denigrated just to prove that you're kind of more religious than somebody else is what they saw happening here. As well, we see here that in section 3, I started looking at the connections between the rejection of anti-Semitism and dissatisfaction with contemporary Malaysian politics and the Malaysian state. So this idea ultimately that we see this kind of rural-urban divide here, this notion that people are angry at the fact that they're being controlled through their religion, and they're looking for secularism, and they're looking for individual freedom, and they want also tolerance, and they want diversity. And ultimately, they say there's a general urban population in Malaysia. They have a feeling that the Israeli Jews have been unfairly framed or portrayed in the media. And this was something that I was hearing Malaysian people say basically for the first time. And there was also a sense of injustice and persecution from these participants. They really hated the racial politics that they were subjected to. One Chinese participant said here, I always felt very disconnected from this country. I just never felt that I truly belonged. And there was also this notion that one was saying the Malays here, they have all of these assistance, say, in the economy in this way. And she said there's this anger when you start hearing all this sentiment that we have kind of taken things from the Malays, whereas the Malays have these opportunities that we don't have. And so there was this kind of anger, there was this sort of sense of injustice, shall we say, and in particular it wasn't directed at other racial groups, it was directed at authorities, and it was directed at the insistence of racial politics. You see one girl here was really upset that she always had to define herself by her race in the country here. Also as well, there was strong anger at the state control of religion. So this intertwining of race and religion in particular did not fit with these participants. They're saying things like religion is a private thing. Even among Muslims, we have different interpretations. I don't have the right to intrude against your personal freedom. I really like my religion. I'm not a Muslim because I was born into it. I was born into it, but I decided to choose this religion later on. So there's this idea that she's saying here that it is patronizing, in a sense, that you're taking away from my personal choice when you choose my religion. And notably, she was being very mature about this. She wasn't rejecting Islam on this basis. She was saying, you don't have the right to control how I interact with it. Ultimately, as well, the construction of the Palestinian Campaign was one that for them revolved around, this is the Palestinian Campaign in Malaysia, was about basically hating Israel. It wasn't about, it was very one-sided. It wasn't about human rights. It was basically about creating hatred against an other here. And this sort of hypocrisy here that we turned away a boat of Rohingya refugees last year, so I don't think we're in a position to preach to Israel about human rights as well. And ultimately, one young girl was very upset. She was Malay, and she said, why do you have to use religion when it's obvious that the modus operandi is based on your political gains, your territorial gains? Why are you dragging religion into this? It's not a religious war, it's a war for territory, and it's upsetting when people equate me supporting Israel as me being un-Muslim and un-Islamic. So there's this anger kind of acts, so we say, sort of social control here over religion. And ultimately, there was also strong recognition of the relationship between anti-Semitism and internal forms of racism. So this notion, certainly, that we have this kind of, the idea that it parallels my identity as a Chinese. There have been stereotypes about the Chinese or the non-Muslims, like how the Chinese are money hungry, all right? So there's this kind of notions ultimately that there are parallels between the Chinese minorities in Malaysia and that of the Jews in Europe in the animosity that is directed against them. And then finally, my final section, because I'm almost done, because I know that I'm almost out of time, we see also these pro-Israeli expressions. So this curiosity, this support, and also this philosemitism here as well. So this idea of reaching out to Jewish people and Israeli people on social media and learning more about the Palestinian situation, the Palestinian-Israel situation, learning more and more nuanced understanding of this situation, wanting to find kind of this closure, she's saying in this way. Also curiosity. One Malay guy told me when he was in London, he spent the whole time looking for a synagogue because he wanted to see what a synagogue was like. Another one says, I'd really like to go there and see for myself what it's like. So there's curiosity about Israel. Also as well, this kind of idea that you mustn't tell anyone. All right, you mustn't tell anyone that you're interested in Israel, that you're interested in Judaism. And also this kind of idealized admiration that became ultimately philo-Semitism in many ways, okay? So this idea that Israel is a nation that survives in this way as well. And a lovely quote that I like, which is about educating yourself about the Holocaust as well. And one young Malay Muslim girl talked about how she'd looked up what the Holocaust was on the internet and was so incredibly shocked by what she found, and couldn't stop thinking about it, and was angry that no one had educated her about it, and also started reading about Anne Frank after that as well. So ultimately, to kind of basically conclude the presentation then, I have more to say, but I probably should leave it there. We see this idea that ultimately Israel and Judaism within this context is kind of functioning as a tool of social criticism. So in the same way that this kind of idealization of the Palestinian cause was ultimately about constructing oneself as Malay and Muslim and kind of dispossessed and having to fight off a foreign invader, ultimately identifying oneself as a modern and secular citizen, whatever your race and whatever your religion, was about becoming was articulated by becoming interested in Judaism and interested in Israel as well as a nation. Now, it becomes more complex as well in the contemporary context, and I'm just about to publish an article actually where I kind of talk about how this has been updated since the general election in 2018. But I think as a presentation, I will certainly leave it there, and I hope that people will have a few questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for this immensely rewarding presentation. We have a question from Avi Gold. So before I ask you my own questions, I would prefer that you answer the questions that are coming from the audience. So Avi Gold asks, in terms of expressions of pro-Israeli or philo-Semitic expression, did the Malays interviewed seem more cautious than Chinese or Indians due to the legal status of Islam in Malaysia, or were the levels of guardedness basically the same?
Yeah, I'd say all of the participants seem quite nervous, expressing their interest in Israel and Judaism. The Malay participants were not more nervous, but they were more angry because they were called people who were more controlled by the state, I would say. So they were angry because ultimately they felt like their identity and their relationship with their religion was basically being kind of stolen by the state, was being dictated by the state. And I think that made them a lot more angry than these kind of Chinese and Indian participants who were, although they were discriminated against, they were also less subject to some of the laws, the religious laws of the state, I'd say.
Okay, so a related question is that, which I've also posted in the chat box, is what is a stronger factor in the anti-Semitism in Malaysia? Is it anti-Zionism or Islamic scriptural polemics?
I would definitely lean towards the political rather than the religious. I actually found, I'm sure you can dig deeper and find some theological basis for this within the nation that may be spouted by some religious figures, but overwhelmingly it wasn't there. This wasn't a theological position, it was a political and it was a racial position overwhelmingly. There was like, even you saw one of the participants was actually talking about asking her Muslim friends, like, why do you believe this? And they had no idea. They said, oh no, it's just part of being a Muslim, it's just part of being who I am, it's part of being Malay. So there was no theological, there was no scriptural basis behind this at all in any way. And that's actually part of the curiosity from some of the Malay and Islamic participants. You notice the one guy who spent the time looking for a synagogue when he was in London, and this is actually because he wanted to know more about the monotheist traditions that Islam ultimately came from. So it was part of carving a greater theological understanding of his own faith, was learning about Islam and Judaism. Israel and Judaism, I should say.
In your discussion of the anti-Chinese sentiment, I felt that it seemed to be so that the Jewishness has come to be perceived in Malaysia as a negative characteristic, which is now attributed to the Chinese because of their entrepreneurial skills, their business acumen. Am I right in understanding so? Yeah,
I think the characteristics like the entrepreneurial skills, for example, are characteristics that are associated often with diasporic groups. So the characteristics that we may see as being kind of Jewish stereotypes in some ways are often ones that are associated with groups that have kind of been forced to be in diasporas, because you have to kind of work hard in that way. You have to be entrepreneurial in many ways. You know, not all of the professions are open to you, so you drift to certain ones as well. And dealing in money is one way to do that. And you have to work very hard, have a strong work ethic, and you have to have close family ties, for instance, for your social kind of security and network. So those characteristics are ones that were very similar between the large Chinese minority groups and the large Jewish minority groups. And so the kind of resentment towards these groups was one that was about kind of, these people have come in and they've prospered, they must have taken, and we are not at the same level economically, so they must have taken something from us in this way. And of course, that's what authorities directed. I mean, this isn't a direct parallel, of course, but there are some parallels, shall we say. These are very different situations, but there are certainly parallels in terms of where you have a large diasporic minority, and there's this perception that it's prospered economically, and so there's this notion of, oh, they must have taken what is ours. There's also the fact in Malaysia as well, though, that there is also discrimination towards Malay people as well. There are racial stereotypes towards them. There are, you know, the racial stereotype of the lazy Malay is one that's highly damaging too. I didn't mention so much of Mahathir's kind of sort of social Darwinism, like he's often singled out for his anti-Semitism, but really he maintains these racial stereotypes about all different social groups, not just Jewish people. And he Malaysian scholars speculate that he probably has a very strong sort of belief in social Darwinism, shall we say. And it's this basis that he should be attacked on, rather than anti-Semitism per se. It's his continued deployment of racial stereotyping that lies at the heart, really, of his discourse.
If I remember correctly, I read somewhere that Mahathir Mohamad also has some Indian roots, Indian ancestral roots.
Yeah, well, Malaysia is a really diverse nation. And I'm talking about these groups separately, but you know, there are all kinds of different races and different nations, people from different nations and backgrounds there. And that's Southeast Asia as a whole, you know, Indonesia and Thailand and everywhere. It is, Southeast Asia was often known as the crossroads of the world, you know, between China, between South Asia, between the Arab countries, all of this. So it's an incredibly mixed and rich part of the world in terms of resources and people.
We have another question from Abby Gold. She asked, in terms of expressions of pro-Israeli or philosemitic expression, did the Malays interviewed seem more? No, this is a question that we have already answered.
I think we've had that one. Yeah, I think we've been over that one before.
But I had a question that given this strong resentment against the Chinese, there seems to be a very strong sense of majority victimhood among the Malays there. And this seems to be exactly the case among the Hindus in India, who have a strong sense of majority victimhood, where the vilified other is the Muslim. And here in Malaysia, the vilified other is the Chinese. But what has been happening in India is that Holocaust has come to be perceived by Hindu nationalists as a model to emulate in their calls for retributive violence against Muslims. Do we witness calls for retributive violence against the Chinese in Malaysia in a similar pattern?
No, not that I have seen. I'm sure it exists somewhere in maybe the dark corners of the internet, or maybe somewhere in an online Malay language publication, but I haven't seen that as being part of dominant social discourse. There's plenty of Holocaust denial around Holocaust denial discourses and conspiratorial beliefs around, but I haven't seen that, no. Actually, this is quite interesting because there tends not to be outright expressions of violence towards the Chinese minority. And one reason for that is because the Chinese minority are actually very significant to the country. And they were also quite well integrated with the local Malay elites as well, sort of when they first kind of established a foothold in the nation. So they tend not to be directly targeted so much, I think, because social elites need them. What is interesting actually is that is one reason why people say, scholars say, and I also agree with this, anti-Semitism is so high, is because it becomes a cover for this, in a sense. It becomes a cover for this resentment. So it is less socially acceptable to directly attack the Chinese minorities. And so you attack kind of the Jewish other as a proxy for this. And this is actually one reason why I think anti-Semitism is so much higher in Malaysia than it is in Indonesia. In Indonesia, the Chinese majority is much smaller, sort of compared to the rest of the population. It's not so crucial, shall we say, to the vote in the way that, to the vote perhaps, and to the economy in the way that it is potentially in Malaysia. And so there's less need to use anti-Semitism as a kind of proxy for that. So that is sort of one theory as to why this is so high within Malaysia.
Right, right. And given this great enthusiasm in Malaysia to protest against Israel, I was wondering if there have also been any protests against the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang.
I believe recently there has been some, but it has not captured the imagination the way that the Palestine-Israel situation has. And this is also interesting as well, because we also just next door have the treatment of the Rohingya, who are also, of course, Muslim people. And the interesting element is that you're there's sort of a question as to, well, I mean, these people are undergoing a terrible and very genuine genocide, and you see them fleeing to Malaysia. And their treatment in Malaysia is quite horrific at times. Malaysia refuses to recognize them as refugees. The state discourse against them characterizes them as sort of like ogres, or kind of bestial and dirty, and all of these kind of terrible sort of terms you see towards fleeing refugees. A lot of that is to do with racism. So there's racism against dark-skinned South Asian people. So they are similar to, for instance, the Bengalis or the Achinese that will come to Malaysia and will do kind of the menial jobs. And there's a kind of hierarchy of sort of refugees, as you see, with the sort of Middle Eastern people kind of at the top, and this movement down to at the bottom when you see the Rohingya there. And it's left to kind of well-meaning networks of kind of mosques and good people to help the Rohingya people. So I think that sort of illustrates how this really isn't about religion in any sort of theological sense in essence, and it isn't about human rights, because there are so many contradictions within it as a discourse as a social discourse, shall we say.
And given this strong anti-Zionism in Malaysia, I was wondering, how have the Abrahamic Accords been perceived there?
I couldn't tell you, sorry. That's not something I know about, I think. But I did actually just notice that I think we have another question that's just come in.
Yes, Avi asked that, did any of the interviewed connect pro-Israeli or pro-Jewish views with interest in models of Jewish financial success, similar to the way it is expressed in China or South Korea?
Mm-hmm. A little bit, but it wasn't as prominent as the construction of Jewish people as being kind of survivors, like resourceful survivors. That was the more kind of dominant, sort of construction of Israeli people and Jewish people being strong, being survivors, managing to keep going, particularly sort of being kind of a minority country and surrounded by kind of Islamic countries. That spoke to Chinese people especially, who felt that they were sort of under threat in many ways. But above all, it was a kind of, they they privileged this sort of construction of survival, I would say, above all. There was some idea of Jewish people as being very resourceful, but it didn't fall into the same, from my participants, it didn't fall into the same stereotypes about money. That only seemed to filter into anti-Semitism rather than philo-Semitism.
As I understand that the Malaysian Muslims have a sense of deference towards the Arabs, given the fact that Prophet Muhammad was an Arab. So now that several Arab countries have made peace with Israel, do you think that would in any way influence the Malaysian attitudes towards Israel to any degree?
That is really interesting, because it actually kind of shows how Malaysia is actually starting to be kind of left behind the rest of the Islamic world, as many of these nations move to build relations with Israel in the contemporary age. And it sort of feels like this attempt to kind of sort of out-Islamicize the other nations and prove your kind of Muslimness on the sort of global Muslim scale actually has resulted in kind of being unable to move beyond that and progress kind of beyond that, because you still see this very, very anti-Jewish and anti-Islamic sentiment. However, I do kind of believe that while it is allowed, I don't think it is actually as big as people think. And I think the nation is becoming a lot more polarized, shall we say, than it was before. And this is largely to do with the growth of the urban Malays. So this notion of Arabization, I would say, is often a kind of, it's not about theology, it's a construction, and it's very, very performative. So it doesn't have any theological and political nuances within it. So I think it's very difficult to kind of move it back. It's very difficult to sort of change it in many ways. And it also actually gives the Islamic authorities some ability to kind of say, look, you see, these Arab nations are not true Muslims. They're not, we are the ones who have ownership over this discourse, over this religion. So actually, by sticking to this position, they are all capitulating, but we're standing strong to this kind of true construction of a faith there. So I don't see it changing amongst those who believe this and amongst those who control it. But I see less people buying into it, and certainly the urban Malays who are becoming much more secular and much more globally connected, I see starting to fall away very much from this belief system. I think that answered that question.
Yes, you did. You did.
Okay.
Thank you very much for answering all our questions so patiently. Your presentation today has immensely enriched this webinar series that we are convening together. And I express gratitude to you on behalf of ISGAP and on my personal thanks to you as well for agreeing to speak as part of this series of ours. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk today.
Oh, thank you very much, Navras. It's very kind of you to say that. And I enjoyed giving it. And I do hope that people learn something. And everyone's welcome to get in touch with me. Welcome to get a hold of my book if you want to know more as well, because I did sort of skip over some parts quite briefly due to time limits. So, but thank you very much for having me on this.
And we would also like to thank everybody who joined us today for today's webinar. And we would request you to join us again on the 7th of April, when we shall have a scholar from Korea speaking on anti-Semitism and Philosemitism there in South Korea, in the East Asian context. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.